All right, so here's what I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about why we get tired. Why is it that at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the vast majority of people, we hit a wall? Why, right? You're not really sleepy in a sense, right? You just can't think straight. You have a little bit of brain fog, cognitive decline. You get this slump, right? And I think it's very common. And what do? We automatically reach for caffeine. We reach for coffee, go to espresso, an energy drink, right? Something sweet just to kind of push us through, waiting for the day to be over, right? And then sometimes we even get a little burst of energy towards the nighttime. So what is it about this kind of afternoon slump that we get? And we've been given the same reasons, right? You're not sleeping enough, you're getting older, you're stressed, it's normal, so we get all of these answers, but they don't really explain why it is that we get tired. Why do we have fatigue, right? Fatigue is one of those symptoms that is so non-specific that clinicians don't really know what to do with. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about metabolic capacity, right? Because it's not just about sleep. Although sleep is incredibly important, right? That's not the real answer, but bad sleep will 100% cause somebody to become tired. And there are a million other reasons. There are a lot of factors, there's a lot of inputs, right? It could be stress, it could be chronic inflammation. But then the question is, what is actually happening to create the fatigue, to create the tiredness, the slump, that cognitive decline that we experience kind of at 2, 3 in the afternoon, right? So I want to be very clear right now. If you're not sleeping well, that's going to be the first place you want to look at. You want to improve sleep quality, sleep hygiene, things of that nature. But for a lot of people, the crash, right, that crash that we feel in the afternoon, it shows up despite having adequate sleep. And the question is why, right? That kind of tiredness, we automatically think is normal because a lot of people experience it. Sometimes we even put it on ourselves. Maybe I'm just lazy, right? But what I want to do is I want to shift the angle a little bit and actually tell you that maybe it's not any of that stuff. I want to actually dive deep into the cell and tell you at the cellular, molecular level, why is it that we feel tired? Why do we feel fatigued, right? And the good thing is, this is something that we can change. This is something that we can change actually pretty quickly. It doesn't take months or years to start seeing improvements in the way we feel, in the energy that we feel so that we can be more productive, depending on what it is you do. And if you're interested, I also created a metabolic capacity assessment. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Metabolic capacity, the ability for your body to not only create energy, but to use energy and then to recover from the demand that has been placed on you. That's metabolic capacity. I created a quick 2-minute assessment. You can click the link in the bio if you're interested, and it'll rank you on where you fall on this spectrum. And then I'll show you how you can actually start to feel improvement. So let me actually break this down. There's actual biology. There's real biology. There's real science as to why, right? Remember, there's 3 jobs that we need to do right now. And the cells have 3 specific jobs, and they need to do it every single day. They need to do it all day long, right? Along the way, I'm going to show you why reaching for that caffeine, that cup of coffee, that energy drink might actually make things worse, right? And so let's define it very, very simply, metabolic capacity. What is it, right? It's the ability for your cell, for your whole body actually, to do 3 things. And that's what I want to focus on right here in this lecture. So what are they? Produce energy, use it well, right? Manage it. And then the last part is recovery. And the recovery part is whatever the demand has been placed on you, are you able to recover from that, right? It could be exercise, it could be stress, it could be a work day, whatever the case might be. So in essence, produce, use, recover. Very simple, right? And when you got all 3, you've got solid metabolic capacity, right? You can handle a hard day and barely feel it. Not only feel it in the moment, but on the days to come. Now, when one of those problems arises, when one of those systems or portions of the system is weak, that's when we feel it. And fatigue, being tired, that's one of the first places that this shows up. So let's take each of these one at a time. And we're going to start with producing energy. Okay, so everything that your body does runs on a single molecule, okay, mostly. And that molecule is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And it's basically, we can think of it in very simplified terms, it's basically the cash that your cells use and spend to do things, right? And so what are we talking about? We're talking about everything. Moving a muscle, firing a thought, building a new cell, fighting off a virus, everything gets paid with ATP. And here's the thing that surprises a lot of people. We don't actually store a lot of it, right? At any given moment, your body is only holding about 250 grams of ATP. And what does that mean? That means that you only have enough energy to actually run you for a few seconds, right? You don't have enough ATP stored in reserve for the whole day, you actually only have it for a few seconds. So you're not living off this big reserve as you might think. You're actually building this stuff constantly all day long. And as soon as you build it, you burn it because of all of the things happening in the background, right? That's resting metabolic rate, your basal metabolic rate. It's all of the things that require energy, even if you were not to move the entire day. And so over a full day, you roughly make your entire body weight in ATP. So think about this for a second. If you are 180 pounds, you're actually making close to 180 pounds of ATP every 24 hours. That's crazy, right? And so where does this happen? All right, so this happens inside the cells, and where it's supposed to happen most of the time is inside the mitochondria. These are these organelles. A lot of people call them the powerhouse of the cell. And yes, they are the powerhouse. Yes, they create ATP. And that's honestly a very important function, because without that, the cell, whatever tissue it might be in, can't do its job. But the mitochondria do so much more. Not the point of this lecture, but I just want to plant that seed that mitochondria actually orchestrate all of these things in your body. And it's not just about ATP, although it's obviously very important. Okay. So, all right, let's move on. So we already know we need ATP. It creates, it's this cash currency that the cells use. And how do we make it? Okay. So we have two ways that we can make ATP. One is the very fast and crude way, right? We need ATP quickly, so we're going to make it. And that actually happens outside the mitochondria in the cell. Now, the cool thing about this is it doesn't need oxygen, right? The bad part, and you can make it quickly. The bad part is you don't make a lot of it, right? So you make about 2 ATP for every molecule of glucose when you do it this way, okay? The other way, the way that is more efficient runs inside the mitochondria. This actually uses oxygen, and because it uses oxygen, we're going to call this oxidative phosphorylation, okay? That's the more efficient way of creating ATP. It's slower, but it does require oxygen, but it'll net you around 30, 34, 36, depending on the textbook that you want to look at. But essentially, you're making 15 times the amount of ATP doing it this way for the same molecule of glucose or sugar, okay? So your ability to produce ATP isn't necessarily on how much you're consuming in the moment, right? Yes, we use food, we break down this food, and it's the breakdown, the amino acids, the glucose, right? All of these things that we can then use for ATP. However, that's not the full story. It's not about just the stuff that's coming in, because how many people have you heard of fasting, right? They fast and they feel okay, but there's no food coming in. So how are they making ATP? Well, there's a second part to this, right? It's also about how good, how healthy, how efficient your mitochondria are, and do we, number one, have enough oxygen, right, to actually run this process? So somebody with a lot of healthy mitochondria, for example, they're going to be able to pull out an enormous amount of energy out of the same food, right? The same amount of food, the same amount of calories. Now, somebody whose mitochondria are damaged, unhealthy, dysfunctional, whatever the case, whatever verbiage you want to use, well, they're going to be leaning a little bit more on this other way of making ATP. So they're going to be getting those 2 ATP outputs more often than they are going to be making these 30, 32, 34 through the oxidative phosphorylation, right? So do they make it inside the mitochondria? Because they have healthy, functional mitochondria. And obviously there's a lot of other components. We have to have the right environment. We have to have vitamins, all of these cofactors and whatnot. But essentially, where are we making this ATP, right? Because if you're running low, if you're feeling this afternoon crash, then no matter how clean you're eating in the moment, no matter how early you went to bed, if your mitochondria can't efficiently create the ATP necessary to run all of the things that are happening or necessary to run in your body, then you're going to feel it, right? The number and the health of your mitochondria is a real physical thing, and it's one of the biggest levers in this whole system, this whole idea of the way we feel. Now, again, like I said, making energy is only one part of the story, because you can make a lot of ATP, but you can still feel the effects. You can feel wrecked, you can feel tired, you can feel fatigued, the brain fog, the cognitive decline. You can feel all of these things, well, if you can't use it well, right? And so this is kind of where we start to feel this afternoon crash. Your body's always working on a budget. Okay, it's splitting energy between this thing and that thing, and it has to prioritize. It has to triage. What are we going to do, right? Do we need to repair tissue? Do we need to allocate some for digestion? Maybe because we're eating lunch. Running the immune system, if you have chronic inflammation, that's a very expensive, energetically expensive process. So we're going to be moving ATP towards that instead. Thinking, moving, exercise, recovery, all of these things require ATP. And so these are all factors, right? That's why stress can create this feeling of being drained, because now we have to allocate resources to that. HPA axis gets activated and whatnot, right? Exercise, it's a hormetic stress. All right. So think about that for a second. Now, here's the idea that a lot of people just don't know, or they haven't been told, right? A healthy metabolism can run on two different fuels. Okay. So the ability to be able to switch between this fuel and that fuel, that's called metabolic flexibility. And so what are we talking about? We have the ability to create ATP from glucose, right? Breakdown of carbs, sugar, or fat. Right? And it's the ability to be able to use whatever's available in our environment that is actually what we determine or classify as having a healthy or having metabolic flexibility. Metabolic inflexibility is the inability to actually switch between those things, right? So again, how easily can you flip between going from using glucose to using fat? But then the reverse is true. Can you easily go from using fat as an energy source to then using glucose? So it runs both ways. And the question is, okay, well, why does that matter so much? So let's look at some numbers. At any given moment, right, you've only got about a teaspoon of glucose in your entire bloodstream, okay? That's about 4 grams that's circulating inside of you. That's 1 teaspoon. That's like nothing. Meanwhile, even a lean person can have thousands of calories stored in fat. So you've got a tiny little tank that has glucose, but you have this massive reserve of ATP, of calories, of potential energy, I should say, that's sitting deep in fat stores. Think about that for a second. A metabolically flexible person can dip into these fat stores whenever they need to, and they can do it effortlessly. That's how you can actually go into a fast and not feel all of these things. But if you can't tap into the fat stores, then you're solely relying on glucose, but you only have a teaspoon of glucose in circulating in your entire system. And so that becomes a problem, doesn't it? Right? If you skip a meal, if you push lunch back for a few hours, you feel it, right? Because you can't quietly tap into your fat stores. And then the question is why? Okay? Why? Why can't you do that? Because of insulin. Okay? When someone's been living on refined carbohydrates for a very long time, their insulin typically runs high as well. Right? And if you have chronic hyperinsulinemia, and that doesn't always mean that, well, I did a fasting insulin and so it's fine. Just like doing a fasting glucose can be misleading, so can a fasting insulin, right? Because what happens after you eat? Well, if you're in the morning, your fasting insulin is here, and then you start eating the way you're not supposed to be eating, well, your fasting insulin is not only going to spike, but it's going to stay elevated. So you're going to have these peaks and valleys of insulin, which is also not a good thing to do, just like we don't want to do that with the glucose, okay? But if somebody's been living on refined carbs for a very long time and their insulin is running chronically high, that insulin is actually doing something very specific. It's actually locking away fat in storage. It's putting a padlock, and it's not allowing it to be used for energy, because insulin's main job is to store energy. So it pushes towards storage, right? So as long as you have elevated levels of insulin, you physically can't access the fat to then generate ATP, right? There's a classic metabolic science behind this from a researcher named Philip Randle. You may have heard of the Randle cycle, right? This happened in the 1960s, and they call this the glucose fatty acid cycle. Now, the short version is that sugar and fat compete to be burned, right? So we can just think of it very simplistically. They're competing. It's a little more nuanced than that, but essentially what happens is your hormones are picking the winner. So picture that inflexible person at 2 p.m., right? They have this big carb-heavy lunch. What happens? Insulin spikes, okay? And then blood sugar starts to fall back down, okay? And they can't switch and they can't tap into the fat stores because why? Insulin is still elevated. And so because insulin is still elevated, it's still holding the fat hostage, unable to be used for ATP. So we have a drop in blood sugar, but we have no backup fuel coming in. And that's what we feel. We feel the crash, the fatigue, right? We feel the brain fog. We have these sugar cravings, because we literally need more energy, and your body knows that the only way to get it is with glucose. You reach for a third cup of coffee because you think the caffeine is going to give you energy. And it's not. So I want to reframe this, right? You're not lazy, right? There's something else that's happening. There's a fuel system in your body, and it can't change gears. Okay. In a lab, you can actually have somebody breathe into a machine and you can measure out the gases that are coming out and you can calculate something called the respiratory exchange ratio. So very briefly, a number that is measuring at about 0.7 means that they're burning mostly fat. If they jump up to a 1.0, then that means you're burning mostly sugar. In a flexible person, a metabolically flexible person, that number drifts up and down all day long because they can cycle through. The problem with somebody who has metabolic inflexibility is they're stuck. They can't do this, right? So you can sit there, you can watch this, you can feel it, you can experience it. Okay, so we've already talked about we need ATP, right? Clear. We need to be able to produce it. We need to be able to use it. But there's a third job as well that often gets dismissed. We don't think about it as much, but it's so important, and that's about recovery. Okay, so we're trained to think, let's talk about fitness, for example. We're trained to think about being fit as having this mean peak output, right? How much can you lift? How heavy can you go? How fast can you run? How far can you run? But capacity isn't really just about that peak, how far you can push your body in just a second or so, right? It's not really about the peak. It's about what happens after the demand, after the exercise, after the stressful situation, after the long work hours, right? And the question is, how fast can your body bounce back? How fast can it come back down to baseline? Because look, you can have two people that look fit. They can go to the gym, do the same exercise, work identically just as hard lifting and running. One person can be fine by dinner. They're recovered. The other person, they feel dead for days, right? They can't go back to the gym the next day. And so that gap that I'm talking about, the recovery, that's capacity. How much of that metabolic capacity do you have? Remember, metabolic capacity encompasses all three of these things. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and just briefly introduce the nervous system right now. The nervous system runs in two main modes, if you will, right? We have the stress mode, the sympathetic nervous system, which is the gas pedal. Then you have the recovery mode, which is the parasympathetic. And we can think of this as the brake. And so we're kind of doing this all day long, right? And so a high capacity body drops cleanly into that recovery mode the moment the demand is over. You can actually measure how well somebody actually does that, right? We can do this through something called HRV, heart rate variability. And what is heart rate variability? It's basically just this tiny variation of timing between heartbeats. The more variability that you have, it means that your recovery system is online and it's responsive, okay? Chronically low variability means that you're stuck with this engine constantly revving, burning energy, but you're burning energy that you can't even spare, okay? And so this is where maybe the caffeine can come back in the store. This is where we all reach for this, right? The mechanism behind caffeine is actually really interesting. It's really cool. And it's not what I initially thought it used to be back in the day. I used to think that caffeine would give me energy, but it doesn't, right? So now look, every time your cells spend, I should say, ATP, remember it's adenosine triphosphate, they leave behind a breakdown product, and that product is called adenosine. All right, so we use up ATP, and then we're left with adenosine. Over the day, that adenosine builds up, right? It just builds up across the day, and then what happens, that adenosine then settles into receptors in your brain, okay? And that rising level is one of the actual signals that makes you feel tired. So we have this sleep pressure that increases. We have adenosine that starts building up. They're putting itself on these receptors in your brain, and we start to feel tired. That we can think of that as your fuel gauge, okay? So what does caffeine actually do if it's not giving us energy? It actually just blocks adenosine from attaching to the receptors, right? It slots right into those exact same receptors, and it blocks them. So adenosine can't attach to them, and we don't have this buildup in sleep pressure. But it doesn't give you energy. It just prevents the adenosine from doing its job. Because by the end of the day, you have so much adenosine, that's what makes you fall asleep, okay? So it doesn't give you any energy. It just covers up the gauge, if you will, right? And that's exactly why the second and the third cup of coffee, they stop working, right? And that's why as soon as the receptors are cleared, boom, you crash. And you crash harder because you feel it the second the receptors are now fully available to intake all, because the adenosine's still there. So boom, they attach to the receptors and we feel tired. You didn't really refuel. You just put on a Band-Aid and eventually that Band-Aid wears off, right? You taped over the warning light, if you will. Now, here's the good news. That same machinery that lets the capacity slide is the same machinery that we can use to build yourself back up. Okay. So same biology, same principles. We just kind of do it in reverse, if you will. So when you put a real demand, a real stress on your body, whether it's working out, whether it's fasting, whether it's doing, we can think of it a hormetic stress, cold plunges, right? There's sauna. All of these things are stress. But then when you let your body recover and you're able to feed it the things that it needs to recover properly, it doesn't just come back to baseline. You come back stronger because you adapt, right? And so what ends up happening? How do we adapt? Well, the body prepares for the next war, if you will. And it builds more mitochondria. It creates more mitochondria. There's a name for this. It's called mitochondrial biogenesis. So the next time that you've got this energy, you've got more of these energy producing machines than you did previously. So we adapt and we can handle more of that stress. That's why when you first start working out, you can only lift so much. Then as you create more mitochondria, you can lift a little bit heavier. You can lift a little bit longer. You can run an extra mile. And your recovery improves, so you can do it more often. You know, the first time you work out, you shred up your muscle and you're sore for a week. You start to adapt. And that's the entire game. The adaptation is the entire game. The recovery is the game. You want to push your body. You want to induce this stress and then recover. And then your capacity increases, right? This is why recovery isn't like dead time. A lot of people, and I know this myself, right? When I first started to work out, I used to think that I had to go to the gym every single day because it's when I'm in the gym that I'm actually lifting the weights and building the muscle. But the opposite is true. We're not building anything in the gym. We're actually breaking things down. We're tearing up your muscle. And then it's what happens afterwards. Getting the right nutrition, getting an adequate amount of protein, ensuring that you have micronutrient levels that are sufficient, ensuring that you're getting proper sleep, because that's the rebuilding phase. That's where you get stronger. That's where the muscle builds. Not during the actual stress itself, but the stress is still necessary. Otherwise, you have nothing to build, right? And so just something that I used to think as a teenager, I have to go, but you know what? That's not really the case. So recovery is actually where the capacity gets built. So why do we get tired, right? Now you can actually answer it. It's not laziness, and it's not always about sleep, although clearly sleep is going to be first principles here. It's one of the three of these things within your metabolic capacity is weakened, right? It's falling short somehow. You're either not producing enough energy efficiently, or you can't flexibly reach the fuel that you've already got, or you're not recovering from the load of an ordinary day, right? And here's the thing. It doesn't have to be a stress that you would classically categorize as a stress. It's all independent on the person. It's contextual, right? Because something that might be stressful for me might not be stressful for somebody else, and vice versa. So again, it's contextual. It's what the body perceives as stress, right? Because we all have different capacities. So the thing that might stress you out might not do anything for me because our capacities are a little bit different, the metabolic capacity, right? And so most of the time, though, it's a mix of all three. We can't make enough. We can't tap into the fat supplies to actually use because we have elevated levels of insulin. And we can't recover because not only maybe physiologically we can't recover, but maybe we're not doing the right things to allow proper recovery, okay? But then you add them all together, that's literally what metabolic capacity is, right? And the reason any of this is worth knowing is because none of these things are fixed, right? You're not born one way. It's not just this way for the rest of your life. That's why lifestyle is so important and so impressive, because it can move the metabolic capacity. Your mitochondria, your fuel flexibility, your recovery, every one of those things responds to everything that you do. So we can actually improve this the more that we do these things. And it has shockingly little to do with your age. This whole notion that the older we get, the less muscle we have because of just our the way we're growing and aging, it's not true. We can still build muscle the older we get. We're just probably not doing the right things. We're not eating enough protein. We're not putting the same amount of stress. We're not sleeping. We're not providing our bodies with the building blocks that it needs. It's not necessarily predicated on genetics, right? It's not predicated on whether your labs are normal, because your labs never measure these things. It doesn't measure metabolic capacity. It doesn't measure the ability to create ATP or to use ATP or to recover from demands. Those are real life things that we experience every single day, right? You can move all of these levers. That's what I want you to take away from this. All of these things can be moved. They can be improved. But They can also worsen if you're doing the wrong things, right? But the first step is just knowing which one of these is dragging you down right now. So that's what I want to leave you with. Like I said earlier in this video, I built a short assessment to help you figure out exactly what that is. Where do you land? It takes 2 minutes, right? And it walks you through the same 3 things that we just covered. How well do you produce energy? How flexible are you? And are you able to recover, right? So that you don't feel depleted, but you actually build towards what I like to call resilient health. Resilient health is what comes after somebody is quote unquote healthy. And when you take this assessment, it'll tell you exactly where you land. Are you depleted, or are you all the way over here with resilient health? The link is in the bio. It's 100% free. Take it. And then we'll also send you your own roadmap on how you can actually start to improve your metabolic capacity. Okay? Because here's the other thing. That wall that you hit every afternoon isn't just part of being alive. It's not normal, and it doesn't have to happen, and it doesn't define who you are. You're not lazy. It's biology, it's physiology, it's a signal that's coming from a system, your system, that you can actually change. Okay, so go see where yours stands. Click the link in the bio. I'll see you there. To better health and better science. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.